I'll get started because, well, we don't have so much time today. So good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for joining today. And thanks to SAPEA for proposing to have this discussion. So as you may have read, I had to come in at the very last minute to replace Ines in moderating this. She had an urgent thing that came in between, so please bear with me. For the sake of clarity, so this webinar is part of a series of webinars which SAPEA is organizing in relation to their report, A Sustainable Food System for the European Union, which most of us are quite familiar with. And SAPEA agreed to organize a special session for participants in the EU Food Policy Coalition, and especially to discuss Chapter 5 of their report, which deals with policies. Now, the program for today is quite straightforward and simple. After these opening remarks, there will be some quick housekeeping by Toby Wardman. Then a 5 minutes introduction to SAPEA by Celine Tjihard, and then a presentation by Jeroen Kandel about the report, and then specifically related to the policy chapter. After that, we'll have time around half an hour for questions and basically just a bit of a wider discussion. So I give the floor to Toby for the housekeeping now.
Thank you very much. Hi. Just a word or two from me, and then I will mute myself and stay quiet for the entire meeting. My role is just to kind of do the background technical stuff. So just to say a word or two about how it will work technically. This is a closed briefing that we've organized specifically for you, the people on this call, the organizations that you represent. So for that reason, we've set it up as essentially in the webinar system as a shared meeting format. This is most important because it means that we ask then a certain level of awareness from you. In particular, please be disciplined about using the mute button. When you join the meeting, you're muted, so please stay that way until you're invited to speak, and then you can mute yourself. And then obviously mute yourself again when you have finished speaking. Anyway, you all know how it works. We've done a few of these since the start of 2020. We've all been around the block a few times. In the meantime, we have got the chat running alongside the meeting, so please feel free to type questions, comments, whatever you like in the chat. You use Twitter in parallel if you like, if you want to reach a wider audience. And when we come to the discussion part of the session, we will also have a look at the chat and see if there's anything that needs pulling out of there to be discussed by the speakers. One last point about recording. We are recording this webinar, but having had a little discussion with the organizers, as this is a closed meeting between friends, we want you to feel free to have an honest and open exchange with each other. And for that reason, although we are recording it, we will share it first only with all you, the participants, after the meeting. And then if we do publish it online, for instance, on the SAPEA website or the EU Food Policy Coalition website, we will only do that after you've had a chance to say, actually, no, please don't. And in which case, that's also completely fine. I think that's pretty much all from me, except to say that if you have any technical issues and you need to leave and rejoin or anything, that's completely fine. Please just do. Use the same link as before and it will continue to work. And if there's anything technical that you're struggling with in the system and you'd like some support, send a chat message to me. A username here is SAPEA Communications, and you can choose to send a message just to me rather than to everyone. And I'll reply to you directly and hopefully we can get that sorted out. Other than that, please. Good meeting. And I'll hand over now to Celine, who will introduce the topic and the report.
Thank you, Toby. Hello, everyone. So I'm Celine Tjihard. I'm the Science Policy Officer in the SAPEA Consortium. There's 5 of us. So a little bit of background about SAPEA. SAPEA stands for Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. So we're a consortium of 5 federations of academies of sciences funded by a EU Horizon 2020 program. And so through our networks, we really bring together high-level expertise in engineering, humanities, medicine, natural and social sciences from over 100 academies across Europe. And we work together with the European Commission's group of chief scientific advisors to provide independent scientific advice to European commissioners to support their decision-making. So we, SAPEA, we provide the scientific evidence in the form of evidence review reports, and these reports in turn inform the scientific opinions of the advisors. We provide the scientific evidence and options, and the advisors make the recommendations. So last year, the advisors have requested from SAPEA an evidence review report on sustainable food systems, answering the following question. It's a bit long, so bear with me. What are workable paths to deliver an inclusive, just and timely transition to an EU sustainable food system, considering co-benefits for health, the environment, and socio-economic aspects, including the socio-economic situation of the farming sector, and addressing territorial imbalances, the rural-urban divide, food waste, as well as responsible consumer behavior, and all this from a social sciences perspective. So SAPEA composed a working group of top-level experts, and one of them is with us today, nominated by academies, who over the course of a year drafted this report that is going to be discussed today. So this report informed the advisors' scientific opinion, and together they had some influence on the Farm2Fork strategy. So our evidence review report and the scientific opinion were published at the beginning of April 2020, so at the heart of the COVID crisis. So we developed this webinar series that explores and discusses different angles of our reports. And if you're interested, please visit our website to know more about these webinars. The next one will be on the 16th of October, so please save the date and spread the word. But let's go back to what's bringing us together today. We're very thankful to the EU Food Policy Coalition for showing us such interest in our work, and we're looking forward to today's discussions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce now Dr. Jeroen Kandel. He's going to present and discuss with you some key messages of the SAPEA report, especially focusing on EU food policy and governance. Jeroen Kandel is one of our working group members. He is assistant professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and his expertise lies in food policy and governance, sustainable food systems, food security, EU policy and governance, wicked and cross-cutting policy problems, and policy integration. Jeroen, please, the screen.
All right, thanks, Céline, and it's a real pleasure to be here together with so many of you who share an interest in EU food policy. I see some familiar faces in the audience, which is great. So what I would like to do with you in the coming 20 minutes or so is to share some of the key messages from our report from a governance perspective, which is an almost impossible task because, well, you just heard the research question that we got, which was very broad, and we had to review the full range of social sciences. So it was a huge task, but I think that nevertheless we obtained some insights that are very interesting and relevant for me to share with you today. So I will just walk you through the main messages of the report. And then by the end of the presentation, I will also share some of my own recent research on the Farm2Fork strategy, and then hopefully we can have a very nice and fruitful discussion afterwards. So I hope you can see my full screen. About the report, so I'd like to start with sharing some of the main governance messages. So you could say that these are three overarching messages in terms of the governance observations and recommendations that we make. So first of all, we observed, and this is what we also took from the social science literature, that if we look at EU policy discussions and also the thinking about food in EU policy processes, that these discussions tend to be dominated by a rather narrow framing of food as a commodity. So as you could say, an economic
Jeroen, sorry to interrupt you, but
Sure.
I cannot see your PowerPoints.
You cannot see my PowerPoints.
No.
Well, then something is going wrong. We just practiced this, but let's try again. What about now?
Yes.
Better?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, as I was saying, so we see that policy processes tend to be dominated by a rather narrow framing of food as a commodity. And one of the recommendations that we make, and I think that's also one of the recommendations that got most attention in media reports about the report, is that we recommend to really approach food from and food systems from a broader perspective. So not just as a commodity. Of course, we're not saying it's not a commodity. It is, but apart from a commodity, food also raises questions about human rights. And thirdly, we also propose to approach food more as a commons. And framing, it's not just about playing with words. I think one of our messages is also that how we frame food and food system also has a huge impact on the policy solutions that are proposed at EU level. And I think you all recognize that well, the use of frames and of the role of ideas plays a very dominant role in EU politics. Secondly, we say, and this might be a bit of an open door to many of you, but I think it's still an important message because often forgotten, that if you want to change the food system, this also requires a change of broader governance regimes at EU level. And with governance regimes, I mean the ways in which we steer the food system. You could say the way in which our political institutions are organized in a broader sense. One key question that I will come back to towards the end of my presentation is, for example, how do we actually involve those actors and stakeholders working in the food system? So how do we make sure that we involve them in the transition towards more sustainable outcomes? And then thirdly, we argue that food system governance, so the steering of the food system, is not just an EU issue, but really transcends the boundaries of jurisdictions, so policy domains at the European level, but also at national levels, but then also across governance levels. So I think if you want to steer the European food system towards more healthy and sustainable outcomes, that coordination and integrative leadership are very much key. But these are three very overarching, you could say more abstract messages that I will try to make more concrete in the coming slides. So if we look at policies more specifically as a way of steering the food system towards well, desired directions, you could first of all say that, of course, there's already a range of policies that are actually quite promising. And so not everything is bad. There's also good initiatives, good well, developments going on at EU level. And at the same time, we see that either there are policies that that have the potential of having a much larger contribution than they currently have, or that currently seem to impede or constrain a transition towards more sustainable outcomes. Secondly, I think a very important and also a very promising development is that we see the emergence of actual food policies. So food policy until recently, it remained a bit of a, you could say, more academic concept. So whereas national governments and the EU, they used to have an agricultural policy or environmental policy, but not such a thing as a food policy. And more recently, we do see that an increasing number of countries, but also of lower governments, start to develop and adopt local or national food strategies. And on the right, you see the food strategy of Sweden. But I have some more examples later on. On the top right, you see the good food strategy of the city or the region of Brussels. And I think, well, you will know many more of these examples. So I think the emergence of actual food policies is also a very promising development. And then another broader observation that we make about policies is about policy instruments. And of course, this is quite a sensitive issue, because we do see that politicians and stakeholders, they do often agree on the ultimate goals, the need for climate action, for sustainability, for increasing public health outcomes. But that things become more controversial as soon as we start talking about how to get there, so about the instruments or interventions. But at the same time, we see that there is quite a difference between the effectiveness of instruments, where more coercive instruments, such as the use of taxation, but also interventions, direct interventions in food environments, tend to be more effective than softer instruments, such as information campaigns. That may raise awareness, but we know from psychology, from other social sciences, that these are often ineffective in really realizing behavioral change if they're not complemented with other types of instruments. While at the same time, we do see that most governments still tend to rely more on these softer instruments, because, of course, politically they are much easier to sell, because they make less of an impact, you could say, on EU citizens' daily lives. So these are some of the overarching policy observations in the report. And what I would like to do next is to zoom in on some of the main observations for 4 different governance levels. So from the global level to the local level. So to start with the global level, and this is a level that we often tend to forget, especially as I think researchers and stakeholders, practitioners focusing at the EU level. But we see that food and agriculture are actually quite exceptional in that they're one of the few domains in which there is a very dense configuration of global standards. So still, even in times of, you see Trump on the bottom, and you've all witnessed the ongoing trade war between the US and China, and more generally the ongoing debates about the desirability of free trade or free trade agreements. But still we see that a large part of food standards, of agricultural standards, also fishery standards, are actually made at a global level. And well, you could say there's also advantages to having these some of these agreements at global level, because they also allow for increasing sustainability beyond and also food safety beyond the EU. So some examples that I've noted down are agricultural trade, the agreement on agriculture, WTO regulations, law of the sea for fisheries more specifically, the Paris Climate Agreement under the UNFCCC. So it's not just trade, also for environmental legislation, global level has a huge impact. And then there's a whole bunch of softer legislation that does not necessarily have any legal standing, but that does have political influence nevertheless, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And at the same time, apart from this more, you could say, public regulation, we also see the emergence of all kinds of private or public-private standards that, for example, try to make a global value chains more sustainable. And this is what we call the hybridization of food governance. So in certain parts of the world, we actually see that that private initiatives sort of fill the gap that governments leave in regulating a global value chains, such as the chain of sustainable palm oil. While at the same time, this of course also raises questions about the legitimacy and control over these types of regulation. So I think important question also because of the political events is whether globalization is in retreat. I don't think so. I think globalization as a force is still ongoing, but we do see that a number of global institutions have severely weakened, such as the WTO, and now that the US has stopped the funding, WHO, which is received a lot of criticism during the COVID outbreak. And so we do see some serious, serious weakening of some important global institutions, which of course does raise concerns about the degree to which we'll be able to also pursue the sustainability agenda on a global level in the future. Next, the EU level. So of course, there's a lot to say about what's going on at EU. I think an overarching observation for food policy is that even though we do see a tendency towards food policy coordination, that food policy is still very much characterized by a high level of fragmentation, where we see siloed policy making, we see incoherencies between policies that remain insufficiently addressed at EU level. But of course, this is something that is rapidly changing. So I think it's already quite something that food policy is now on the political agenda of the EU. I think also a very clear observation or also recommendation that we make is that the EU is well placed to take action in some domains, like agriculture or fisheries, trade, but not so much in others. So I think especially as actors working at a European level, we often tend to immediately look at EU institutions to take action or to develop new legislation. But for example, if we talk about public health, I think we should also think more critically about the role of the member states and how what is being done at the EU level could be better coordinated with the member states, because some of the main challenges, they really arise around the coordination between what's going on in the national capitals and Brussels. We see some relatively successful policies. So food safety, even though, of course, there's still criticism on how food safety is being governed. The role of EFSA, for example. This is an ongoing discussion, but we see that, especially in comparative perspective, if we approach it from a global perspective, that the EU is relatively successful in minimizing food safety risks. We also see that quite some resources are invested in R&D, for example, with the Horizon 2020 program, resulting in tons of research outputs, new innovations related to food and agriculture. Now, I think the clearest elephant in the room, and I think this cartoon very nicely shows it, and I think it's also an observation that many of you will recognize, is the CAP, which has been criticized for decades already because of its external effects. I think almost everyone agrees that the current system of hectare payments is ineffective, regardless of what outcomes you prioritize. So more socio-economic outcomes like the incomes of farmers, or environmental public health outcomes. I think from any perspective, the CAP is not very effective, and still it proves a very resilient policy in the sense that every reform round we see that reforms remain either incremental or even symbolic. So one of our recommendations is really to address the main incoherencies vis-a-vis food policy, and I think the CAP is one of the clearest examples. And the second one is policy coherence for development. So, of course, when we have discussions about the EU food system, we might forget about the impacts that the EU food system has on other parts of the world, where we actually see that EU agricultural trade policy actually has quite a bit of a constraining effect on food producers in other parts, notably Africa. And the EU institutions, they have this ambitious system of policy coherence for development, so really trying to minimize these detrimental impacts. But in practice, we see that this system remains very symbolic and does not really have much of a policy impact so far. Then national level, and here we really, if we look at the EU, we really see notable differences between member states, where some member states, they really have embraced food policy as a priority and have developed actual food policies. I just showed the example of Sweden, but Finland, Denmark, the UK, well, officially not a member state anymore, but still a neighboring country that I think many of us are interested in, are taking quite far-reaching action, especially in the field of public health, where some countries have either adopted Nutri-Score or sugar taxes on sodas. So some of these more coercive instruments that I mentioned before. whereas other member states, well, we see that food policy is either absent from the political agenda or only very slowly emerging. So I think this is there's still a lot of work to do to really increase the sense of urgency across European national capitals. Now, another observation is that for agriculture, whereas the CAP, of course, is one of the European policies, we see that the CAP gives more and more space to the member states to sort of fill in the implementation of the CAP at national level. So the CAP allows for more and more flexibility. And as a result of that, we also see that some of the member states have really started to develop, you could say, parallel national agricultural policies. I think France is a good example where the French government invests quite a bit in agroecology, or at least trying to improve the ecological impacts and principles in agriculture. Whereas in the Netherlands, for example, we have a very big discussion about what is called circular agriculture. So really try to close nutrient cycles in agriculture. A tool, a policy of which we think that it's is relatively low-hanging fruit, and I'm not saying it's easy to change public procurement policies, but it is something that, compared to changing the CAP, governments can do relatively easily, is to make public procurement more well, a focus on sustainability criteria, and by doing so also create a larger market for sustainable produce. And so far, I think here in the Netherlands, for example, if we look at hospitals, schools, sustainability is still hardly an issue, and we see the procurement still largely focuses on the costs of produce. Then at local level, I think this is really the level where we see the most promising developments, where cities have really started to develop local food strategies, where actions become very concrete. So also, if we look beyond the EU to the US, Brazil, where we see that cities have a bit more experience with food policy than most European cities, and we see that effective leadership, effective action at local level can really make a difference to citizens' lives. But again, that's global EU coordination can play a big role in disseminating these practices, these policies across places. I think the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact is a very good example of that. And we also see that local level is really an experimental ground for more collaborative and democratic approaches to the food system, like the food policy councils, which are rapidly gaining popularity in Europe, in Germany, for example. And these also give ideas about how we could create similar arrangements at national, perhaps even at EU level. So how can we really involve citizens and food system stakeholders in deciding upon the future of the EU food system? Now, this raises the question of, okay, how can we do better? So how can we develop food system governance arrangements that do better in terms of well, fostering a transition towards more sustainable outcomes. And I will only mention these 5 recommendations very briefly. You can read more about them in the report. But there's basically five good governance principles that we recommend. First of all, we say, and this relates to my earlier point about the framing of food as a commons, that there's need for a more system-based problem framing. So what are we actually talking about? What is the issue here? I think all of us are now familiar with the concept of food systems, but we should not forget that to many political actors, this is still a rather abstract term, and that they do not immediately understand the interrelatedness of problems, of challenges in the food system. And so this broadening of this concept of this framing, I think, is still a very important step. Also, we need to increase the connectivity across boundaries, so between levels of government, but also between policy domains. I think some of your organizations are actually doing this. You try to connect policy efforts across boundaries, to share best practices, to lobby at different levels, and to sort of connect the dots to improve coordination. Adaptability is key. And so we see that the food system is rapidly changing, while policies tend to be very rigid. So how can we also develop policies that allow for this type of flexibility, which might be an interesting point to further discuss in the discussion. Inclusiveness, this point of food democracy. How can we involve citizens and food system stakeholders? And lastly, transformative capacity, which is a bit of an abstract term, but we basically mean that there's a need for investing in, you could say, the pioneers. So those actors in the food system, and there are many that are already showing that things can be done differently, while at the same time also doing something about the status quo, because we see that currently, and SAPEA again is a good example, most public resources still support the status quo, and which makes it much more difficult to foster a real transition. Now, lastly, I want to say something more about the Farm2Fork strategy, which all of you will be familiar with. And together with my colleague Hanna Sebesta, we have recently written a paper in which we reflect on this Farm2Fork strategy and the degree to which it can actually contribute to such a food system transition in the EU. And I think firstly, and very importantly, this strategy is a very welcome initiative. It's the first time that EU institutions, the Commission in this case, have adopted a policy strategy that comes close to an actual food policy and that approaches the food system in a more holistic manner. And so I think we cannot underestimate the importance of this step. But then, of course, it's only a beginning, and it's still a very vulnerable process. So there are 5 challenges that we observe. I think there could be more, but these are, I think, 4 of the most important, and that really need to be addressed to make a success out of this, out of the implementation of the Farm2Fork strategy. First of all, we say that even though the strategy focuses on food sustainability or food system sustainability, it remains very unclear and uncertain what is actually meant with a sustainable food system. And we see that there's all kinds of trade-offs between, for example, increasing or strengthening circularity and climate impacts. In the Netherlands, for example, we argue that for circularity, it's good to let cows graze on grass meadows, whereas for climate objectives, that would actually be a detrimental thing. Also, stakeholders have different ideas about what a sustainable food system looks like. So we really need to have this discussion about our priorities. We also still see a very big discrepancy between objectives and legal actions. So the strategy, if you read it, well, I think we all get a very warm feeling. But then if you look at the actual legal actions and instruments, it runs short of any real concrete measures. Or there's some, but there's also, again, some elephants in the room, like the CAP. Of course, the Commission promised a legal framework that will follow in 2023. Well, I look very much forward to the measures that it will propose. The complex institutional embedding, and so already within the Commission, I think we've all seen that. Well, the embedding of the Farm2Fork with Sante, with public health, also means that some other domains, notably again agriculture, have been less involved. And the Commissioner of Agriculture has actually said, well, the Farm2Fork strategy is not meant as a strategy to reform the CAP. Well, and that's exactly the problem, that there's still it still doesn't serve as an overarching strategy that then also guides the further development of more sectoral policies. And then there's the issue of multi-levelness. So how do we also coordinate between what's going on at EU level and the member state level? And I think, especially in the next steps, where the Council and the Parliament will play a big role, many of us, I think, will have to invest quite some time and energy in also making national governments aware of the need for coordinated action. So finally, looking ahead, of course, this whole discussion is now also dominated by COVID and by the projected economic crisis that the EU will face. So one of the big questions is how can we maintain the momentum of the Green Deal and the Farm2Fork strategy, which was so promising, while at the same time dealing with the economic crisis. So I think, again, an interesting question perhaps to discuss later on. And secondly, which is really one of my priorities and also one of my research interests, food democracy is rapidly rising as a concept. So there's an increased awareness that we need to have democratic innovation in the food system, and I think very much also at the European level. But how to actually do this? It still remains a very abstract concept. So how to practically organize this? Can the existing institutions like the EESC play a role in this, or would we actually need to build new institutions at EU level? So those were some of the key messages of the report. I hope you found this of interest. As I said, there's much more in the report, so depending on your interest, we can zoom in on more specific topics. But for now, I would like to thank you for your time and interest. And I look forward to have a nice discussion together. Thanks a lot.